Our next writer, William Elliott Hazelgrove, is a best-selling author of 10 novels and 3 works of nonfiction: Ripples, Tobacco Sticks, Micah Highways, Rocket Man, The Pitcher, which both my wife and I really liked, Real Santa, Jack Pine, My Best Year, The Bad Author, The Pitcher 2, Madam President and the Secret Presidency of Edith Wilson, and the upcoming Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt. His books have received acclaim in Publishers Weekly, Book List, Book of the Month, Literary Guild, History Book Club, Junior Library Guild, and the ALA Editor's Choice Awards. And some have been optioned for the movies. He was once an Ernest Hemingway writer in residence in Oak Park, Oak Park, and has been interviewed on NPR's All Things Considered and just recently on WTTW's Chicago Tonight. William, please.
Thank you for having me. I wrote a book of narrative nonfiction, and I think I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and squeeze a lot into a very short period of time. Madam President, the Secret Presidency of Edith Wilson. I wrote it after I read Scott Berg's biography of Wilson, where he had a very strange line in it. He said Edith Wilson was almost the president. And Wilson's Berg is a very conservative Wilsonian historian, so I thought, why would he write that? So at that point, I'd written the novels, but I had a master's in history, so some of them were historical, so I sort of became intrigued, went to the papers of Woodrow Wilson, and what I came away with was this man was totally paralyzed. He was paralyzed on his left side, he couldn't see, he was bedridden. When the doctors first came in, he was paralyzed, pretty much his entire body, and then his right side recovered. His wife, Edith Wilson, he'd only been married to her for 5 years. She was a very interesting woman, 2 years of schooling, that was it. She was born in Whiteville, Virginia. Whiteville, I actually went there recently. It's a teeny-weeny town in Virginia. You can only get there by flying into Roanoke. She escaped Whiteville, married a guy named Norman Galt. He was older, had a jewelry company. He died after their baby died. She then took over the company and ran it herself, made money at it, bought herself an electric car, was tooling around Washington, and then a guy named Woodrow Wilson was buzzing by after his first wife had died, Ellen Wilson, who was a very refined woman, an artist in her own right, and said, well, who's that woman? A guy named Dr. Grayson turned to him and said, well, that's Edith Galt. He arranged a meeting. Wilson was very smitten with her right away. This is 1915. World War I is brewing around. And within about a year, they married. She was a very fast on the draw type of woman, had a photographic memory, but she had absolutely no experience in government. Wilson had high blood pressure. He had hardening of the arteries. He'd already had many strokes. By 1919, at the end of the war, they were hacking it out with the League of Nations. Wilson was very ill. He went across the ocean with Edith and basically had another stroke over there. And then when he returned, he had a massive stroke, leaving Edith to run the government. What happened was a guy named Dr. Durkheim turned to her after she had the stroke and said, basically, we need you to step in. Any kind of stress will kill the president. We believe he can recover, but we'll help you. And that was really the moment where she sort of had her charge. And Edith ran by access. She kept Wilson in the bedroom. She put a desk outside, and basically everything went through her. If she couldn't deal with it herself, she would just push it back. In the 1950s, tons of correspondence from the Wilson years were found in the National Archives, unopened. Remember in 1919, there was no fax, no internet. Everything was done by correspondence. So Edith sort of managed the best she could. She let tons of things became laws. Legislation went through, because I'm sure you know this, but if the president doesn't act on something within 10 days, it becomes law. Edith let just about everything go through, so it was a very productive time in the Wilson administration. When Wilson got a little better, she would put him in a Coney Island wheelchair, because that was the only thing that would keep her up, and push him out to the South Portico. Then she started to show him movies. These were movies of the time. Wilson didn't like any sort of accompaniment, so he would sit down in the Red Room of the White House and watch these silent movies. And then he continued to get a little better, and so then nobody had seen the president for 5 months, if you can imagine this. The White House sort of resembled a Victorian hospice. It was locked, dark, traffic was diverted. There was actually a band that was playing a few blocks away during a wedding. They had that stop. Not many people were coming into the White House. So they felt like if they drove him around, the talking would stop. People thought Wilson had gone insane. They said the bars and the upstairs windows of the White House were to keep him inside. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt put him there to keep his kids from falling out of the upstairs windows. But the rumors persisted, so they put Wilson into a car. They had the Secret Servicemen lift him in, put him in the back, and had him face out on his right side that wasn't paralyzed, and drove him around Washington in this sort of Addams Family car. And then Wilson was also suffering from dementia at the time, so when people would pass him in his car, he would demand the Secret Service go after them and bring them back so he could try them on the side of the road as speeders. And the Secret Service would always return and say, "Oh, we couldn't get him, Mr. President, so sorry." But Edith kept the ship together up the way up. I'm giving you really a thumbnail of what went on, but up to 1921. They did leave the White House when Harding came in. And Wilson died in 1924. Edith lived to 1961, went to every inauguration of every president. She was a remarkable woman. I think I had kind of thought that I would be saying this, that she was the first woman, Madam President, and there was another one in there now, but I'm not saying that, am I? I'm saying that there was one Madam President, but she was really it. And interestingly enough, when you go through the papers of Woodrow Wilson, the correspondence up to 1919 all goes to him. It's Dear Mr. President. After 1919, 1921, everything is Dear Mrs. Wilson. So that really told me that people in the know understood that she was running the White House, among other things. Also, the United States writes a little biography of every person that's ever in the White House. They wrote one on Mrs. Wilson, and if you look it up, they say that she did run the executive for 2 years. So with that, I'm going to read a little bit. I'm not sure exactly how much time I have, and just a little note about the way I write this. I am a novelist pretty much, so I write in scenes, and I believe in verisimilitude, which is the closest approximation to truth that you can have. This is called The Cover-Up. President Wilson lay with his mouth drooping, unconscious, having suffered a thrombosis on October 2nd, 1919, that left him paralyzed on his left side and barely able to speak. The doctor believed the president's best chance for survival was in the only known remedy for a stroke at the time, a rest cure consisting of total isolation from the world. His wife of 4 years, old Edith Bowling Wilson, asked how a country could function with no chief executive. Dr. Durkheim, the attending physician, leaned over and gave Edith her charge. "Madam, it is a grave situation, but I think you can solve it. Have everything come to you, weigh the importance of each matter, and see if it is possible by consultations with the respective heads of the departments to solve them without guidance of your husband." From there, Edith Wilson would act as the president's proxy and run the White House, and by extension, the country. By controlling access to the president, signing documents, pushing bills through Congress, issuing vetoes, isolating advisors, crafting State of the Union addresses, disposing of or censoring correspondence, and filling positions. She would analyze every problem, decide which ones to bring to the president's attention, and which one to solve on her own through her own devices. All the while, she had to keep the fact that the country was no longer being run by President Woodrow Wilson a guarded secret. A few guessed at the real situation. A frustrated Senator Albert Fall from New Mexico pounded the senatorial table when he demanded a response from the White House. "We have a petticoat government. Wilson is not acting. Miss Wilson is president." Some saw it as a power grab when Edith Wilson kept Vice President Thomas R. Marshall from seeing the president and preventing that constitutional transfer of power. But Edith believed the doctor's warning that any stress would kill her husband. To keep her husband alive, she would have to shield him from the world, and that meant running the country herself. Even before her husband's stroke, Edith, as First Lady, had participated in the Wilson administration to an extraordinary degree. She and Woodrow resembled a 21st century political power couple. President Wilson kept her close by his side and clearly valued his wife's input, making her partner in many political decisions. In this way, he gave her hands-on treating for her stewardship. I tried to arrange my own appointments to correspond with those of the president, so he might be free at the same time, she would later write. Woodrow gave Edith presidential access to all his work, and she often spent all day with him. As she later wrote, breakfast at 8 o'clock sharp. Then we both went to the study to look in the drawer, and possibly if nothing had blown up overnight, there was time to put signatures on commissions or other routine papers. These I always placed before my husband and blotted and removed them as fast as possible. Edith's participation in the Wilson White House gave her, a woman who just 4 years before had been a widow living alone in Washington, the capacity to deal with the demands of running the United States while nursing her husband. The impact of the president's death was profound and broad-ranging. Domestic problems were on the rise, foreign policy initiatives ground to a virtual standstill, and the League of Nations, first proposed by Wilson, failed to get approved. At a point, the White House had begun to cease to function. Edith Wilson, a woman with only 2 years of formal education, had to step in. She had to make it up as she went along, approving appointments, making foreign policy and domestic policy decisions, orchestrating the cover-up, and restricting access to her husband, who at times was totally gone. When looking through the papers of Woodrow Wilson, one is struck by how much correspondence from 1919 to 1921 was directed toward Edith. She was on the front lines of issues ranging from the recognitions of diplomats to America's entry into the League of Nations. The correspondence of the Edith Wilson years was voluminous. As she later wrote to Colonel Edward House, the president's unofficial advisor, "My hands are so full that I neglect many things, but I feel equal to everything that comes now that I see a steady progress going on." Americans wouldn't see their president for 5 months. Appointments remained unfilled and correspondence piled up. Years later, essential communications to the president that had never been opened in the White House were found in the National Archives. Like someone who didn't have time to get to her bills, Edith had simply thrown them in a pile. The cover-up has persisted to the present day, in part because of Edith Wilson herself. In her memoir, written in 1939, she called her presidency a stewardship, effectively downplaying the true significance of her role. But historians have been complicit in the cover-up as well. While many concede that Edith Wilson was almost the president, they also insist that Woodrow Wilson remained in charge. And while some go as far as to claim she acted as president for 6 weeks, at most, they go no further in acknowledging the extent of her presidency. Many Americans are still surprised to learn that President Woodrow Wilson suffered a massive stroke while in office. But what they find totally inconceivable is his wife, Edith Wilson, was the acting president for almost 2 years. To acknowledge this would be to diminish Woodrow Wilson's legacy. Power is given to those who can wield it, and President Wilson, who remained in bed only to be wheeled out for movies and some fresh air, was virtually powerless. The question then is, who was Edith Bowling Wilson? Was she a woman singularly gifted enough to run the country and nurse her husband back to health? Or was she a woman doing the best she could in a world in which women were seen as little more than second-class citizens? Now, almost 100 years later, we again ponder the impact of our first woman president. To do so, we must first go back to a train car outside of Pueblo, Colorado, in the Indian summer of 1919. It is here in the heat and the dust on September 25th that Edith Wilson's presidency began. Thank you.